let me ask you a question. What is the maximum number of monsters you are comfortable running in a fight? Is it 10, or 6, 12, 16? Can you run 16 monsters in your game? What if I told you you could run 200 monsters in combat encounter? I had a situation in my game last Wednesday where I ran my 13th level characters, a group of 13th level characters, against 200 ghouls, including a handful of giant ghouls in one battle. And it was awesome. It was fast. It was fun. It gave players a really feeling of those scenes from our favorite movies where you're surrounded by monsters and you're blowing them away with giant fireballs that are exploding and people are flying through the air on fire and waves of radiant energy tearing the skin off of the ghouls down to the bone like they got hit with a nuclear bomb. It was fantastic. And it wasn't just narrative. It actually had clear mechanics for people to run it. They understood what they could do. There was actual things being tracked, and yet still it was not much harder to run 200 ghouls than it is to run 5 or 10 ghouls. Today, I'm going to offer a couple of tips and tricks for running massive numbers of monsters against your characters. And we're going to use it through the lens of this battle against running 200 ghouls. So what are the kind of things that I did to make this run really well? And what did I not do? So a common approach for running 200 ghouls is to group them up into large groups and then use what is essentially one big monster to represent a bunch of little monsters. I've never been a big fan of that style because you always have questions about things like areas of effect, whether or not you can paralyze or stun some of them. How do you handle it when the effects that the characters are doing matter when they're hitting individual creatures versus hitting one big creature? If you say I'm running 200 ghouls, but it's really 8 groups of 25, right? Or whatever that is. It's 200 math. So, I'm running 8 monsters that actually count for 25 ghouls. Well, yeah, except what if I do turn undead? Exactly how does that work against your giant thing? Does it just do damage? Then you're coming up with a bunch of edge case rules. So I don't really like that. But if you ran them the way they normally run of tracking hit points, tracking damage done or tracking the current hit points of each of those monsters, you're going to go crazy trying to manage 200 monsters. So I like to run the monsters individually, but I have a couple of tricks that I use to make sure that I can run basically any number of monsters that I want. And I used it when I was running my 200 ghouls. So the first trick I did is that these ghouls were kind of starving ghouls. They weren't the full power ghouls. They were weaker ghouls. And what that meant is they only had 10 hit points each. The nice thing about 10 hit points is that pretty much any real dramatic damage is going to just kill them outright. Almost any attack that the characters do is going to kill a ghoul. And if they drop a fireball on them or something like that, it's going to, you don't even have to worry about rolling saving throws because they're going to take probably 10 damage, right? And if they take 10 damage, those ghouls are dead anyway. So reducing their hit points down to 10 effectively minionize them, sort of similar to the minions that you have in 4th edition. But it's a little bit stronger than minion that you can't just kill them with a single point of damage. You have to do at least 10 damage to do them. In that case, they have sort of a hit point threshold rather than having damage that you actually track. But basically any area of effect that was going to affect them, hit them and killed them. The other trick is I would pool damage done to them. So any amount of damage that they take affected the hit point. It created a damage pool. I would pool the damage up. And as long as the damage hit 10, I'd remove a guy. If it hit another 10, another guy would go out. If it hit another 10, another guy would go out. So that way, if one character swings 3 times and does 45 damage, you know that killed 4 ghouls and you put them right back together. So the damage that is done, even by melee attackers, carries over from ghoul to ghoul. If a paladin, and I told him, we had a paladin, and I said, if you smite, all of the damage from that smite is going to let you hew through a bunch of different ghouls all at once. You can just cut through the ghouls and it'll destroy them all at once. And so they did their biggest smite, and I think they did 53 damage, and I took 5 ghouls out of play. With their sword, they just hewed down 5 ghouls. I didn't worry about the remainder. So if it did 52 points or 58 points, sometimes I might round up and just let it kill another ghoul, but I'm not going to bother to track the little onesie and twosie damage at the end. Instead, if it did enough damage to kill a ghoul, the ghoul is out and I would just round the damage. Somebody asked, like, did you run this in Theater of the Mind, or did you have 200 pinto beans out on your playmat? I ran this Theater of the Mind. So I described it with my words, and we used our brains and our imaginations, that the characters were on a great big hill. There was an archway in the center of the hill. The hill was all made out of dead bodies and decomposed bodies that had been there for thousands of years. And they first saw one ghoul, and they killed that ghoul, and then 2 more ghouls came up, and they started killing those ghouls, and then they heard the onslaught, and they saw these waves of hundreds of ghouls coming towards them, and they're like, uh-oh. And that's when they were like, okay, and they got into position, and they got their spells ready, and they hammered them with spells and destroyed them. So the damage carrying over really helped. And instead of tracking hit points, I tracked the number of ghouls. So I knew there were 200 ghouls. I kept a little tally of 200 ghouls, and every time a ghoul died, I would reduce that, basically keeping track of the number of dead ghouls until it hit 200, and then the ghouls are dead. So it was sort of like tracking the ghouls' lives rather than tracking hit points, right? And that I actually was able to use my combat tracker in order to track damage done to the ghouls, as in how many ghouls are still alive out of the 200. Areas of effect. I winged how many ghouls fit into an area of effect. And thinking back on it, if only somebody had written a better solution to determine how many monsters can fit in an area of effect, particularly when they're hordes. I wish I'd had that. Of course, I wrote that in my own book, Lazy DM's Companion, and I went back and looked at those afterwards and said, yeah, these are really good. So I'm going to offer them to you. I should have had these on hand. I didn't. I winged it, and it worked out fine. But like 80, I had the cleric cast Turn Undead, and he turned 80 of them at once. That was probably a bit much. That was a big Turn Undead. So instead, I have these number of creatures, or the number of creatures that can fit inside of an area of effect, particularly when they're all piled together, because again, they're a great big horde. Tiny areas like a 5-foot radius can probably hit any 2 to 4 creatures. Small areas like a 10 to 15 foot radius might hit 4 to 8 creatures. Large areas like a fireball could hit 16 to 32. I think I had them do 20, that you could kill any 20 ghouls with a fireball, right? And then they could also move the fireball to hit like 19 ghouls plus also hit a big guy. There were 4 big guys that they fought, and that worked well. So yeah, 20-ish in a fireball, that worked pretty well. The huge area is like a 30-foot radius, and this is where like Turn Undead has a huge radius. So it could hit 32 or more creatures, right? You could even go like 32 to 64 if they're all piled up. You think about the number of squares that a 30-foot radius covers, and it's a lot. That's is that 30 squares radius is 30-foot radius is 6 squares out. That's 12 by 12. So if you were all piled around you, it's like 144, unless you cut off the corners, and that's a little less. But that'd be an awful lot. And you wouldn't want one Turn Undead to destroy an entire set of 200 ghouls like that. So you would say the ghouls are probably spaced out a little bit better than that. But the idea of hitting 32, when I think about 80, that isn't totally out of hand, right? But you could go with like 32 to 64 creatures for a huge area. And then lines, you could have 6 creatures in a short line or 8 creatures in a long. You might make those bigger. I wouldn't even say like you could have 16, if you throw a lightning bolt and it just carves through a swath of ghouls, then you could hit 16 ghouls with a lightning bolt, right? That I could certainly see that. So that one worked really well, right? Those areas. The other thing that I did that I think really added to this battle is I also had 4 giant ghouls. I used the hill giant stat block. I just reskinned hill giants, and I had 4 hill giants. And that way the characters had single big targets they could use for either crowd control or, things that they could hit and know that they're fighting one monster, or one monster that they could kind of keep and hold off to the side and make sure it wasn't hitting anybody else. So that way there was a different kind of monster. They had lots and lots of monsters to hit with areas of effect. But if your big melee people are like, yeah, but killing even 3 or 4 ghouls at a time is nothing compared to our wizard who's killing like 20 of them. So I'm going to go tank that big guy to make sure he doesn't hit the wizard. That worked really well too. So what about attacks? How do I adjudicate attacks? Well, I made some rules of thumb up in my head. And one of them was that only, no matter how surrounded you were by ghouls, really only 6 of them are going to be able to hit you. So if there are, 5 characters, each of those 5 are going to be hit by 6 ghouls. So even though you have 200 ghouls, really only about 30 ghouls are able to actually be effective and hit people, right? You're really not going to be able to get much for that. And the way I managed it was I grouped the ghouls together and rolled once for every 3 ghouls, right? So I would roll 1 attack roll, and they would do basically all of the damage that ghoul could do, because I think ghouls only have 1 attack anyway. But even if they had multiple attacks, I would just group all the damage together for each ghoul, group the ghouls together, and then roll once for each of them. One mistake that I made is I rolled once for every 3 ghouls, so basically 2 rolls per character, And then if they got hit, it got 3 times the amount of damage that a ghoul would normally do. In this case, that's about 30 damage. It was like some number of slashing damage plus some number of necrotic damage. And I would offer that up, and I would split the damage up into slashing and necrotic because some people had resistance to one and not the other, and so on. I probably should have done 3 rolls of 2 instead. And I think that would have been fairer to the characters because I could just get lucky and hit with one of them, and they would take 3 ghouls. It meant that half the ghouls would hit. So instead, grouping it into 3 rolls and doubling means that they're more likely to not be hit by so many ghouls at a time. And really, they'd only get hit by one set, and then one set would be double a normal ghouls amount. But the nice thing about this is you can kind of decide how many rolls you want to make, and then essentially divide the total number of monsters that are attacking by the number of rolls you want to make, and that's how much damage that you would do. So that actually worked pretty well. Another trick that I offer in the Lazy DM's Companion, you could just assume that 1/4 of them succeed, and then you can round up or down depending on who they're attacking. So if you get attacked by 8 ghouls, 2 of them are going to hit. But if you'd rather make sure that you're still rolling attacks, and I know that my players actually prefer that I actually roll attacks and just instead of just telling them how much damage they take based on how many of them hit, then one thing you can do is basically say that 1/4 or 1/2 of them will hit, and then roll 2 attack rolls. If both of them hit, half of the ghouls hit. If one attack succeeds, 1/4 of the ghouls hit, and if neither attack succeeds, they take 0. That's another way to do it as well. But I've lately taken to the idea of basically you look at the number of creatures that would be affected by a saving throw or that are making an attack or whatever, and then you divide the total group up into sections and then roll for each one of those groups. I found that worked really well. So when you have these techniques in hand, and I know it sounds a little tricky, right? So you're going to want to kind of think about it. What I recommend is taking a look at the running hordes rules that we have both in Forge of Foes and in the Lazy DM's Companion, which kind of describe both of these ideas. They offer a lot of options for this. Try it out. Try to get your head around it, because the advantage of this is now you can run any number of monsters you want. You never have to worry about having a situation where you're like, it would make sense that they're getting attacked by 100 skeletons, but I don't know how to run 100 skeletons. I'm not going to keep track of the damage done to 100 skeletons or roll 100 attack rolls. That sounds terrible, right? And you're like, yes, that would be terrible if you did it the same way. So instead, here are some techniques that you can use to run truly momentous numbers of monsters and not have it be any harder than running any normal set of monsters that you would run. So that was a trick. It was fun for me to run this again. My players loved it. I loved it. I'm really happy to have this tool in my toolbox, and I wanted to offer it up to you once again. If you enjoyed this show, the best way to get more stuff like this is to subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It is absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator with a miniature version of 5e in it for absolutely free for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG-related article sent to your inbox every week. You can also support me directly on Patreon. Patrons get to watch the 5e artisanal database growing practically every day, but certainly like weekly. You get access to all kinds of other tips, tricks, source books, adventures, things that you can run. Hero tier subscribers get a whole dedicated podcast, a whole separate podcast called Readings and Reflections. They also get access to a bunch of new supplements for City of Arches that I've been working on. Lots of stuff that I give to patrons. Patrons also get access to our awesome Discord community, and they help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Forge of Foes, The City of Arches, Lazy DM's Companion, and more at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.